In a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled just outside the city limits, the young couple had finally found their dream home, a small cozy house with a white picket fence and a backyard that seemed perfect for growing their own garden. They had always dreamed of this moment, a place to call their own, where they could live peacefully and build a life together. But what they didn't realize was that their dream would soon be overshadowed by the oppressive rules of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that governed the neighborhood. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. The homes were well maintained, the streets were calm, and the community seemed like the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors. But what they didn't see was the quiet undercurrent of control that flowed through every decision the HOA made. They had rules for everything from the color of the house to the height of the grass and the types of plants allowed in the garden, and while most homeowners followed these rules without question, there was one thing the HOA had never considered until now. The wife had a disability. She had been born with a condition that required her to use a wheelchair, and over the years she had become accustomed to modifying her surroundings to accommodate her needs. The house they had chosen was perfect for these modifications. It had wide hallways and a ramp that led to the front door, which made it easier for her to navigate on her own. There was a specially designed bathroom with grab bars and a shower seat, but these modifications were now the source of tension that none of them had anticipated. The HOA had a policy against alterations to the exterior of homes without approval, and the wife's adjustments were no exception to this rule. The couple had only been living in the house for a few months when they received their first notice from the HOA. It was a polite letter at first, kindly requesting that the ramp be removed as it violated the community's aesthetic standards. The wife was taken aback at first. She had carefully chosen the ramp to blend in with the house's exterior. It was made of wood and painted the same color as the front door. It wasn't an eyesore, it was a necessity, but the HOA didn't see it that way. The couple thought perhaps this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they could explain their situation and find a compromise, so they decided to attend the next HOA meeting where they could present their case in person. But what they didn't expect was how the meeting would unfold. As they sat quietly in the back of the room waiting for their turn to speak, the couple could feel the eyes of the other homeowners on them. Some were curious, others judgmental. The moment finally came, and they stood to address the board. The husband spoke first, explaining that the ramp was essential for his wife's mobility and that without it she would be confined to the house, unable to go out and enjoy the world outside. He spoke with passion and sincerity, hoping that his words would soften the hearts of the members of the HOA. But it was Karen, the head of the HOA, who responded with cold indifference. Karen was a woman of middle age with a sharp chin and a tendency to talk down to others. Her voice was smooth, but it carried an undertone of authority that made her difficult to ignore. She looked at the couple with a condescending smile and said that while she understood the wife's condition, it simply wasn't fair to let one person's needs disrupt the beauty of the neighborhood. She claimed that the ramp was an eyesore and that the community had standards to uphold. It wasn't just the ramp that bothered her, but the whole idea of bending the rules for one person. She dismissed the husband's concerns with a wave of her hand as if they were unimportant, and insisted that the wife should find a way to live within the existing rules without special treatment. The words stung, but the wife said nothing. Instead, she sat there silently as the husband spoke on her behalf. He was frustrated but determined to stand his ground, not knowing that this was just the beginning of a battle that would change everything. After the meeting, Karen's cold words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The couple left the room feeling defeated, but determined not to give up. They knew that they had every right to make the necessary modifications to their home for the wife's mobility and well-being. The ramp was not a luxury, it was a lifeline, and yet it seemed that HOA and Karen saw it as a nuisance, something that disrupted their perfect picture of what the neighborhood should look like. The husband sat with his wife that night discussing their options. The wife suggested they could try to appeal the decision, but he wasn't sure if that would work given the strict nature of the HOA's rules. He could see how important it was to her to keep things civil and respectful. But something about Karen's attitude infuriated him. She had no right to make his wife feel small, no right to dismiss her needs as unimportant, so he took it upon himself to investigate the legal side of things. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew that discrimination based on disability was illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and he thought perhaps there was a way to fight this legally. He started researching laws and regulations that could help them navigate this situation, while his wife supported him quietly from the side. She had always been the one who helped him through tough times. Her intelligence and calmness had always been his rock, but he didn't realize just how much she had already been quietly working behind the scenes. The wife had grown up with a love for law. She had studied it in school and had spent years as a consultant helping people with legal issues, especially in the realm of civil rights and disability. She had a vast knowledge of the law and had seen firsthand how it could be used to protect the rights of those who were often overlooked and forgotten. But she had always kept this part of her life hidden from others. She didn't want to draw attention to herself or make people uncomfortable. She was happy to be a quiet observer, content with her life and her family. However, as the husband's research continued, she couldn't sit idly by any longer. She began to dig deeper into the legal nuances of their case. Her mind sharpened as she analyzed the HOA's rules and regulations. She pulled out legal books and began to cross-reference the laws that could potentially be used against the HOA. She knew that they were in the wrong, and the more she researched, the more confident she became. She knew this wasn't just about the ramp, it was about the discrimination they were facing and about the need to stand up for their rights. It was about dignity and respect. It was about showing Karen and the HOA that they couldn't just push people around because they were different or because they didn't fit into their narrow view of what a perfect community should look like. So, while her husband spent sleepless nights searching for legal precedents, she worked in the background preparing her own strategy. It wasn't long before the couple decided to take the HOA to court. They had tried reasoning with them, they had appealed to their sense of fairness and compassion, but Karen's arrogance and refusal to listen had left them with no other choice. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the couple walked into the courtroom feeling a mix of nerves and determination. They had never expected things to escalate this far, but now they were here ready to fight for what they knew was right. Karen was already there, seated at the front, with a smug look on her face. Her posture was stiff and self-assured, as though she was certain victory was in her grasp. The HOA's lawyer stood next to her, flipping through papers and muttering quietly to her. They made an imposing pair, and the wife could feel the weight of their arrogance pressing down on her. She was used to being underestimated, but something about the way Karen looked at her made her blood boil. It was as if Karen thought she could get away with anything just because she had the power of the HOA behind her, but the wife wasn't about to let that happen. The husband took a deep breath and glanced at his wife, who gave him a reassuring smile. Her calmness always had a way of grounding him. He had been preparing for this moment, but he knew that it was she who would carry the weight of the case. They had been a team from the start, and today they would be more than just a couple fighting for their home. They would be a force to be reckoned with. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. The courtroom was tense, but there was an undeniable energy in the air as the case unfolded. Karen's lawyer made the first move, presenting a series of arguments about how the wife's ramp violated the aesthetic standards of the community. They claimed it was out of place and detracted from the overall beauty of the neighborhood. The wife watched quietly as the arguments played out. She knew this was coming, but what they didn't know was that she had already anticipated every move they would make. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood up slowly, her voice calm and measured, but there was an underlying strength that couldn't be ignored. She began by addressing the issue at hand, explaining how the ramp was not only necessary for her mobility, but also how it had been carefully designed to blend in with the home's exterior. She explained how the HOA's rules were not just impractical but discriminatory against people with disabilities. She cited the Americans with Disabilities Act and how it required reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Her words were clear and precise, and yet as she spoke, she could feel Karen's eyes boring into her with contempt. Karen couldn't help herself. She interrupted with a sharp comment, claiming that the ramp was still an eyesore and that it wasn't fair for the rest of the neighborhood to be subjected to it. The wife didn't flinch. Instead, she continued her argument without missing a beat. She reminded the court that Karen's personal opinion had no bearing on the law, and that it was the law that mattered, not the superficial concerns of one person trying to impose their will on the community. She pointed out that the HOA was violating not only her rights, but the rights of others who might need similar accommodations in the future by setting such restrictive rules. Karen scoffed and tried to push back, but the wife's arguments were undeniable. With each word she spoke, it became clear that she wasn't just defending her own home, but standing up for something much larger than herself. She was setting a precedent that would make it impossible for the HOA to continue discriminating against people with disabilities, and it was becoming evident to everyone in the courtroom that Karen and the HOA were on the wrong side of history. The tension in the courtroom grew thick as the wife stood her ground. Every word she spoke seemed to chip away at Karen's confidence, and yet Karen's eyes never left her. With a mixture of disbelief and disdain, it was as if Karen couldn't comprehend how this woman, whom she had so easily dismissed as a disabled housewife, could challenge her with such legal prowess. The wife could feel the shift in the room as the audience began to take notice of her words and the power behind them. She was no longer just the wife in a wheelchair, but a legal force who was dismantling the arguments of the HOA piece by piece. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was a battle she was ready for. As the wife continued her argument, she felt a sense of clarity. She knew that she had to stay focused. She had spent years studying the law and working with attorneys, but this was different. This was personal. This was a fight for not just her own dignity, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked or discriminated against because of their disabilities. She wasn't just fighting for a ramp, she was fighting for the right to exist without apology, to live freely and be treated with respect by those who thought their small-minded rules were above the law. The husband watched his wife with a mix of admiration and pride. He knew she was brilliant, but seeing her in action like this was something he'd never expected. She had always downplayed her abilities and kept them hidden from everyone outside their home. But now she was standing in front of the judge with the power of her knowledge and experience on full display. Karen's lawyer tried to object to the wife's arguments, but she was quick to shut him down each time he tried to interrupt. She had an answer ready, and her words flowed with a sense of authority that left Karen's lawyer scrambling for his next move. It became clear to everyone in the room that the wife wasn't just defending herself, but taking control of the courtroom. She had become the voice of reason in a sea of ignorance. Karen grew more frustrated with each passing moment. She could feel the tide turning against her, and no matter how much she huffed or muttered under her breath, she couldn't stop the wife's legal onslaught. It was as if she had underestimated the strength of the woman she had so easily dismissed just a few days ago. Karen's arrogance turned to panic, but she didn't know how to back down now. She had dug herself into a hole, and there was no way out. Her attempts to discredit the wife only made her look more foolish, and the more Karen spoke, the more she revealed her ignorance of the very laws she was trying to uphold. The judge sat back in his chair with a thoughtful expression as he listened to the wife's final statements. He had been quiet throughout the proceedings, but it was clear he was weighing her words carefully. The wife knew this was her moment. She wasn't going to back down now. She made her final point with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She reminded the court that this case wasn't about a ramp or a house. It was about fairness. It was about respect. It was about the basic right to live without being judged for what someone else thought was inconvenient. She had fought for this moment, and she would make sure it counted. As she finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. The judge nodded slightly as if acknowledging the weight of her argument. It felt as though time had stopped, and the entire courtroom was holding its breath. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge took his time reflecting on the wife's argument. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unable to mask her anxiety any longer. Her usual smug expression had faded into something more desperate. The weight of the situation had finally hit her, and she knew that she was losing this fight. The wife had been methodical and precise in her statements. She had dismantled the HOA's case piece by piece, and now Karen was left grasping at straws. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the court, and as he spoke it was clear that the tide had turned completely in the wife's favor. The judge acknowledged the wife's knowledge of the law and pointed out how her argument had been based on both legal precedent and fairness. He made it clear that her case wasn't just about the ramp, it was about the right of all individuals to live with dignity and respect. Karen and her lawyer exchanged uneasy glances as the judge continued speaking, but it was obvious that the damage had already been done. The wife had not only shown that the HOA's actions were illegal, but she had made it clear that Karen's personal biases had no place in this courtroom. Karen's once unshakable confidence now seemed fragile as the judge outlined the next steps. In the case, the wife had successfully put the HOA on trial for discrimination, and the implications were enormous. The judge made it clear that the HOA would have to answer for its actions and that they could no longer hide behind their narrow view of community standards. The wife took a deep breath, feeling a surge of relief, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. She had done everything she could to make her case, and now it was in the hands of the judge. But something inside her told her that this wasn't just about winning in court. It was about making a statement about how far the community was willing to go to protect its most vulnerable members. It was about ensuring that people like her weren't overlooked anymore. It was about proving that no matter what someone's condition or background, they deserved to be treated fairly with dignity and respect. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her mind racing. She couldn't believe how this had spiraled out of control. She had always thought of herself as someone who stood for order and structure, but now she was being forced to confront the consequences of her actions. She had never considered that her own biases and prejudices might have led her to do something so damaging, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how wrong she had been. The wife's words had struck a chord deep within her, but it was too late to undo the damage she had done. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that the judge would be lenient in his ruling, but deep down she knew that wasn't going to happen. As the proceedings wrapped up, the judge adjourned the session with a promise to return with a ruling soon. The wife and husband exchanged a glance of quiet triumph. They had come this far together, and no matter what happened next, they knew they had already won. They had exposed the HOA's unfair practices and made it clear that discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated in their community. They left the courtroom side by side, their hearts light with hope and anticipation. The next few days dragged on as the couple waited anxiously for the judge's decision. The wife spent hours going over her notes in quiet reflection, while her husband tried to distract himself with other tasks, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. Karen and the HOA had underestimated them, and now they were at the mercy of a system that had the power to right the wrongs that had been done. The wife knew she had done everything she could to present their case, but she also knew that this was more than just about them. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been treated as less than because of their disability. It was about making sure that no one would ever have to hide in the shadows or feel ashamed of their needs again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day arrived for the judge to deliver his ruling. The couple arrived at the courthouse early, both of them nervous but resolute. They walked into the courtroom side by side, feeling the weight of the moment on their shoulders. As they took their seats, Karen was already there, sitting in the front row, her face pale and tight with anxiety. Her lawyer was by her side, whispering in her ear. But Karen's eyes never left the couple. She seemed almost desperate now, like a woman who knew she had already lost but refused to accept it. The judge entered the room, and the atmosphere grew tense. As everyone took their seats, all eyes were on him as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. The room was still as he began to speak, and every word that followed seemed to echo in the hearts of everyone present. The judge started by thanking both parties for their patience and thorough arguments. He acknowledged the importance of the case and how it had raised critical questions about fairness and the protection of rights under the law. He looked directly at the couple as he continued, and the wife held her breath, waiting for the words she had hoped to hear but hadn't dared to expect. And then it came. The judge ruled in favor of the wife and her husband. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for the emotional distress caused, and they were required to amend their policies to ensure that any future modifications for accessibility would be allowed without obstruction. The judge also noted that Karen's actions had been discriminatory and that she had failed to consider the legal protections in place for people with disabilities. The courtroom was silent as the judge finished his ruling. The wife felt a rush of emotions flood through her: disbelief, relief, joy, and a deep sense of justice finally being served. She looked at her husband, who was staring at her with wide eyes, his hand gripping hers tightly. Neither of them could believe it. The victory was theirs. But it wasn't just a victory for them, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt less than because of their circumstances. The wife's eyes met Karen's for the first time since the case began, and she could see the weight of defeat in Karen's eyes. Karen's shoulders slumped as if all the fight had drained from her. In an instant, it was clear that she had no idea how to process the loss. Karen's lawyer looked stunned as well, unable to mask his shock. As the judge stood up and adjourned the session, the wife and husband stood together, their hearts racing as they walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, knowing that they had fought for something much greater than just a ramp. They had fought for the right to live freely, without fear or discrimination. As the couple left the courthouse, the weight of the victory began to settle in their minds. But even as they walked out into the bright sunlight, there was no immediate celebration. They were still processing everything that had just happened. They had won, but it felt almost surreal, like something they had only dreamed of. The wife's mind was racing as she thought about the implications of the ruling and the changes it could bring for other families who had been forced to hide their needs in the shadows. She couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for herself, but for all the people who had been discriminated against simply because they were different. She knew the fight wasn't over, but today they had made a huge step forward in creating a more inclusive and understanding world. Her husband squeezed her hand, gently breaking her thoughts, and she looked up at him. He had been quiet ever since the ruling, but she could see the joy in his eyes. His admiration for her had always been there, but now it was like a glow that radiated from him. He leaned down and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." And in that moment, the wife felt a wave of gratitude for her partner, the man who had stood by her side. Through it all, he had always believed in her, even when she had doubted herself. The couple walked to their car in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes about the bond they shared. They knew that this was a moment that would change their lives forever, not just because they had won the case, but because they had stood up for what was right together. They had faced an overwhelming force and come out victorious. The wife couldn't help but smile to herself as she thought about how much had changed since they first moved into their home, how they had gone from feeling like outsiders to becoming advocates for change. It had been a long and difficult road, but now they had proven that their voices mattered and that they would not be silenced. Back at home, the couple sat down together to reflect on the day they had just experienced. They shared a quiet meal and talked about what came next. They knew that the HOA would likely appeal the ruling, but that didn't worry them as much as it had before. The judge had made his decision, and they knew that no matter what the HOA tried to do, the law was on their side. The wife felt a sense of peace wash over her as she thought about how this case had turned out. She had never imagined that her quiet knowledge of the law would lead her here. She had always kept that part of herself hidden, but now she realized that it had been the key to everything. She had the power to change the world, and all it took was speaking up and standing firm. As the night wore on, the couple's conversation turned to the future. They talked about how they could use their experience to help others who were facing similar challenges. They discussed starting a foundation to support people with disabilities in navigating legal issues and advocating for their rights. The wife felt a sense of excitement and purpose as they spoke. They had already done something incredible, but this was just the beginning. They both knew that they would continue to fight for the rights of others and make sure that no one else would have to endure what they had faced. The couple had emerged from their battle stronger than ever, united by their shared determination to make the world a better place for everyone. The days following the ruling were a whirlwind of emotions and activities as the couple began to settle into their new reality. Word of their victory spread through the community, and soon they found themselves receiving messages of support from neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard about the case. People who had been silently struggling with similar issues reached out to express their gratitude for the couple's bravery. The wife felt a deep sense of fulfillment as these messages came in. It was one thing to win a court case, but it was another to know that their victory had inspired others to find their voices too. She had always been a quiet person, content with the life she had built with her husband, but now she realized that silence could be a form of complicity when injustice prevailed, and her silence had been her way of keeping peace. But now that peace felt hollow, and it was time to speak out for those who couldn't. She and her husband spent hours in meetings with legal experts, disability advocates, and even local government officials who were eager to learn from their case and create better policies for accessibility. The couple had become unofficial leaders in the movement, and although neither of them had sought this role, they both understood the weight of the responsibility they had taken on. The wife found herself speaking at local events, giving interviews, and even helping other disabled individuals navigate legal battles. She felt a fire inside her that she had never experienced before. It was as though everything had aligned in her life, and she had found her true purpose in helping others who had once been invisible, just like she had been for so many years. At the same time, the HOA was reeling from the ruling. The media coverage had painted them in an unflattering light, and Karen found herself facing intense scrutiny as well. She had never imagined that her personal vendetta would have such far-reaching consequences, but now she couldn't avoid the backlash. The wife's legal expertise had shown through so clearly in court that Karen's own actions had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the HOA's approach to community living. Karen's public image had crumbled under the weight of the case, and the HOA board was left scrambling to salvage whatever little credibility they had left. The wife couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction in knowing that their fight had exposed the injustice that had been happening behind closed doors. Despite the public attention, the couple tried to keep their personal lives as private as possible. They continued to focus on their mission and on their growing advocacy, while the wife knew that the fight for disability rights would never truly be over. But now she felt equipped to face whatever came next. Her confidence had grown exponentially since the trial. She had gone from a woman who had kept her knowledge hidden to a fierce advocate for change, and she realized that she had a voice that could no longer be silenced. There were still many battles to fight, but this victory had shown her just how powerful standing up for what's right could be. The couple knew their lives would never be the same, but they weren't afraid of the challenges ahead. They had already overcome so much together, and now they were ready to face whatever came next with the same determination and strength they had shown in the courtroom. They had found their calling, and they would continue to make a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed a voice in the fight for justice. As the months went by, the couple's lives settled into a new rhythm. The victory had been life-changing, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter. The wife had become an influential advocate for disability rights, and alongside her husband, they worked tirelessly to make a difference in their community. They began collaborating with local organizations to create resources for people with disabilities to better understand their legal rights and how to navigate challenges similar to the one they had faced together. They had created a network of support for individuals who felt powerless and invisible before their voices had been amplified. They spoke at schools, community events, and even testified before lawmakers, pushing for better policies and more inclusive practices in every aspect of life. It was no longer just about the ramp or their home. It was about creating a world where people with disabilities could live without barriers, without judgment, and without fear. One evening, as they sat in their living room, looking over a new proposal for disability advocacy in their city, the wife paused and looked at her husband with a quiet smile. She thought about how much had changed since the day they had walked into that courthouse together Unsure of what the future held, it felt like a lifetime ago. Now she turned to him and said, "Do you remember when we first got that letter from the HOA? And how we felt like we were fighting a losing battle?" He smiled back and nodded. "Of course," he said. "But you knew even then that we had to stand up for ourselves and for others, didn't you?" She laughed softly and shook her head. "I didn't know. I was just hoping we wouldn't have to fight this hard. But I'm glad we did," she said. "We did it together," he replied. "And that's what made all the difference." They both sat back in their chairs, quietly reflecting on everything they had overcome. Karen and the HOA had faded into the background as time went on, though the impact of the case continued to ripple through the community. The wife and her husband had become symbols of resilience and change. The HOA had been forced to overhaul many of its policies in light of the ruling, and although Karen's public life had crumbled, the wife couldn't bring herself to feel any empathy for her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The couple had moved on, but the lessons they learned from their fight would stay with them forever. They had proven that no one should be afraid to stand up for what was right, no matter how daunting the odds might seem. Their work continued as they helped others with legal battles involving accessibility rights and discrimination. The couple found fulfillment in knowing they were part of a larger movement to ensure that people with disabilities would no longer be marginalized or treated as an afterthought. They had shown that change was possible when people came together and refused to accept injustice. They had become more than just a couple fighting for a ramp. They had become leaders in a fight for equal rights and social change. As the years passed, the couple's work didn't stop. They continued to raise awareness, challenge systems that oppressed, and helped to create spaces where people with disabilities were seen and heard. The wife had found a calling she never expected, but one that brought her a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment. It was the beginning of a long journey, a journey that would continue as long as there were battles to fight and people who needed a voice to stand with them. They knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but they were ready to face them together, knowing that they had already made history and that they would continue to change lives for the better.